the Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today we are joined by political scientist Paul Buchanan, and we will deep dive into how Aotearoa New Zealand is in the crosshairs of two distinct political powers. One has been around for a while and applies influence operations aimed at elites, and the other uses cultural and ideological diffusion that is aimed at civil society. One is a state power and the other is a cultural, ideological phenomenon. The former wants to change the perspectives of elites in favour of the People's Republic of China, whereas the latter originates from the United States of America and aims to change the character of democracy itself. The latter is an underdefined and hardly hidden ideology that we will refer to as Bannonism-Trumpism. So what's taking shape in New Zealand? Why is New Zealand a political lab rat of sorts? And how is this battle taking place for the minds and political thinking of New Zealand voters? What should you be aware of? What political parties are most vulnerable to these two powerful external influences? And what is the end game? And is resistance achievable? So there's a lot of questions there. But before we deep dive into these issues, remember, if you're joining us live, we can include your comments in this program. So let's cross to Paul, who is waiting online and ready to debate these issues. Good afternoon, Paul.
Kia ora, Selwyn. That was a very good introduction, I gotta say.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Thanks for that. Tēnā koe to that, ka pai. And Paul, there's a lot happening in New Zealand politics, notwithstanding what we're going to be talking about today. But of course, obviously, the National Party, which is the one of the two parties of most dominant choice for New Zealanders going back for decades. And the National Party is kind of like the Conservatives, isn't it, in Britain, or the Tories, if you like. It would connect in many ways to perhaps the United States Republican Party in many ways. And its leadership has been dire, to say the least, for quite some time, since Judith Collins took over that leadership, and it's coming to a head as we're speaking. What it has done with respect to her leadership, it does look like, Paul, that the ACT Party, which is basically a natural coalition partner for the National Party, this ACT Party is like economic right reformist kind of party, as a libertarian bent. We'll speak to those points later. And it also has a very burgeoning, perhaps populist, even an authoritarian type of taste to it, if you like, in recent times. But it is expanding and creating opportunities for all sorts of influences at the moment. Paul and I, aren't we, Paul? We're going to deep dive into that. So you probably heard a lot of me introducing things here, Paul. What do you make in the first instance of this international movement that we are picking up, that I suppose in some ways we'll just refer to it as Bannonism and Trumpism, and perhaps we can define a little bit of that and what the differences are?
Yeah, this is actually a manifestation of a phenomena that's been fairly long in the making. And it basically, the basic idea is if it's better to change an adversary or a target from within than confront it from without. So if you think in warfare terms, rather than physically challenge an opponent on the battlefield, if you can undermine him from within with psychological operations, with sabotage, subversion, that sort of thing, then the task of defeating him will be made all the more easier. And this seems to be a manifestation of that, in that on the one hand, you refer to the fact that we've had these Chinese influence operations around for a while, and they target liberal democracies, mostly with money, using the keen thing about the Chinese influence operations is that they don't break the law. They use the existing flaws in democratic systems, let's say with regards to election finance, with regards to lobbying. And they put a lot of money into the pockets of not only political elites, but economic elites in order to influence the perspectives or the perspectives of these elites in a China-friendly way. And New Zealand, and we'll get back to this when we talk about Bannonism and whatnot, New Zealand has been, in the capitalist world, as you just said, a laboratory rat for testing consumer preferences. We have a highly educated population. We have a very sophisticated consumer preferences, and we're really small. So we're a microcosm of the UK, Germany, the United States when it comes to marketing. So when I moved here 20 some odd years ago, I was impressed by the fact that all these gadgets and things were being trialed here. And then 5 years later, when I go back to the United States, they were just being introduced. Well, New Zealand is a perfect laboratory rat for people who want to test liberal democracies or test their strategies on liberal democracies. So the Chinese have pushed this through their United Front operations, have pushed this influence operation scheme. It's seen all over the world. I mean, mind you, New Zealand isn't the only country. But the key here is that it's elite-oriented, and it's not so much designed to subvert the democratic system per se. It's designed to manipulate it in directions that are favorable to the PRC, both in foreign policy, but also in domestic policy. For example, if you can get enough pro-China politicians in parliament, they'll stop talking about Uyghurs and human rights concerns in China. I mean, it's that sort of thing. This new phenomena that you've brought up, that's very different. It's not elite-oriented. It's what we would call cultural ideological diffusion. And it comes not from the state, so it's not as if, the Chinese Communist Party is running this. It comes from civil society actors, political actors, in particularly the United States, who, much as they did after Trump was defeated, promoted the January 6th insurrection via social media and the stuff. It works at the level of society, not at the level of the state. And the idea here is actually to undermine support for liberal democracy as a concept. That is, it's no longer seen as beneficial to the majority, the silent majority, however you want to phrase it. That liberal democracy has run its course, and you need something that's a little harder, more populist in orientation. And this is where Stephen Bannon comes in, because he has obviously read the Russian psychological operations manuals, in which you do direct influence campaigns at the level of civil society. You use social media. You use what they call alternative media. So, InfoWars, Bannon's outfit is called, Counterspin? Yeah, I think it's called Counterspin. Yeah. Things that you can get online. And you don't direct your messaging at the state. You direct it at the fault lines of the target society. And here, New Zealand fits the bill. We're a very liberal democracy, fairly progressive politics. You mentioned that National is the equivalent of the Republicans or the Conservatives. They are, except that even here, our center-right is to the left of the Republicans in the United States and the Conservatives in the UK. Everything tilts slightly to the left in New Zealand. And so for a guy like Steve Bannon to be able to come in and target and literally subvert the faith of the public in the liberal democracy as seen here. And again, we have a very sophisticated political system with MMP. This is not just a two-party state. It's a perfect laboratory rat for his experimentation. And he's done this in Italy. He's done this in Brazil, so he's exporting his brand of national populism, if you will, riding on the coattails of Donald Trump. I mean, one thing we can see now is the incredibly pernicious influence of Trumpism as an ideology all over the world. And so he's now working the fault lines of New Zealand. We, for all the part that we're a pretty peaceful place, we do have fault lines. We have fault lines between Maori and Pakeha. We have fault lines along immigration. And the recent one that Bannon and his types are trying to exploit is the whole issue of pandemic mitigation, and in particular, the question of vaccines, vaccine mandates, masks, and lockdowns. We're now seeing in New Zealand a rhetoric that has never been seen before here about freedom, basically a replication of the rhetoric of the alt-right in the United States. That they're trying to make pandemic mitigation about individual rights, about the heavy hand of the state, that sort of thing. And what concerns me the most is that although this is a small percentage of the New Zealand population who subscribe to these beliefs, the rhetoric that's being imported by people channeling Bannon, what's his name, Alex Jones, the InfoWars guy, is tinged with violence. I've never seen, certainly in my 20 some odd years in New Zealand, the amount of violence that is attached to the anti-government protests like you're putting up on the screen. I mean, again, we'll talk about what "Let's Go Brandon" means, but they're now, using it against our prime minister. There's a heavy dose of misogyny layered in because she's female. But the point is, these foreign influences emanating from the United States are subversive in that they target faith and democracy inside civil society. And as I just said, they're tinged with violence. Even the PRC doesn't go there. They prefer to just manipulate elites. This is a direct assault on, if you will, the organic basis of democracy, and I think it's the greater threat.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that, isn't there, Paul? With respect to opportunism, and New Zealand as the traditional lab rat for many different interests, and what you were talking about earlier on, where technologies would test out their products, how efficiently they work. New Zealand's population base, one being strongly consumerism, but also tech orientated in many respects. We're one of the first to have electronic fund transfer machines at the shop counter. That became a cashless society very quickly. There were the technologies that were rolled out, and first by Bell Electronics, with the Bell telephones and Vodafone and all of those products. Many are here so much earlier than what we see outside of perhaps, with the exclusion of Japan, Tokyo, of course, and Seoul, South Korea, which are first off the block with such technologies. New Zealand is seen as one of those that can test out those products on a Western type of leaning community, if you like, or population. We see it politically too. We talked last week, didn't we, and we have done in recent weeks as well, about the Milton Friedman Chicago School of Economics and neoliberalism economics. New Zealand was a short time after perhaps Thatcher and Reagan on that bent, but it was certainly one that strode out with tariff-free, non-regulatory or minimising regulation around its whole economic discourse, and certainly even for a trading nation, exposing itself to significant risk at the behest of an ideology to test out exactly how it would track. In many respects, I think that would be a claim that would stand up in any forum. What we're seeing here too is an opportunity perhaps with this Bannonism / Trumpism where we've got New Zealand in a sense where we've got centralised control in the COVID pandemic period, where there are strong controls, like in many countries around the world with lockdowns, where New Zealand's policy under Jacinda Ardern and the Labour Party, which is a left-leaning party, or centre-left party, I should say, where centralised go hard, go fast with its lockdowns seemed to be the recipe that succeeded in 2020, and it tried to replicate that when the Delta variant arrived here. This control of lockdown in the homes seemed to breed in 2021 a voice that came out of protest from the anti-vaxxers. We've got Christian parties, fundamentalist Christian parties like the Destiny Church, charismatically wrapped around its leader, Brian Tamaki. We've got many other respects, like those that have come out of the free speech movement, the freedom movement, the freedom of movement, freedom of getting government out of one's face. This seems to have created an opportunity for outside cultural influences. And then we saw, only a matter of weeks after this Let's Go Brandon thing started to circulate through the United States, and the United States audience will know exactly what we're talking about here, and some in New Zealand will by now. We saw those slogans starting to be used at the mass rallies in resistance to the female leader Jacinda Ardern, who has a more centralised popular control of the narrative in many respects in New Zealand politics. So that's what we're talking about here, and whether or not this type of centralism has been opposed by a libertarian bent, that it provides the vehicle for what may come as a populist nationalist type of movement on the back of that, Paul. And perhaps the subtleties of that is something that you and I can discuss and talk about.
Oh yeah, but let's be very clear. The United States represents a classic how not to deal with public health crises. The United States is a disaster when it comes to pandemic mitigation. And the main reason for that is that Trump was in power, and he simply saw no utility in trying to save the lives of his fellow citizens. That's what's being exported. You know, the idea, there's an old saying that those who determine the terms of debate win the debates. Those who frame the political narrative win the narrative. In the United States, rather than be strictly a public health issue, it became an argument about freedom, became an argument about individual rights. It's utter rubbish, utter rubbish. And again, the United States, to my American friends, I apologize, but I don't. It's a disaster. And the reason for that is if anyone had any conception of democratic theory, you know, people don't read anymore. Democracy is not just about individual rights. It's about individual and collective rights balanced against individual and collective responsibilities. And everybody in the United States seems to have forgotten about the responsibility side of the equation. And now they're pushing it on us. This is what Bannon's doing. He's pushing it on us. There's money. It's very clear that dark money is starting to infiltrate the right side of New Zealand's political spectrum. You know, it's not just the crazy rhetoric, the MAGA rhetoric. Again, the violence. You know, you're just showing these tennis balls with slogans. Yeah, I mean, I mean, what is this? This is not New Zealand. And yet, it resonates with the small group of people who see opportunity in fomenting dissent. You know, an example that you know, but our viewers may not, is we had a supposed farmers group called the Groundswell Movement, has been doing rolling blockades in the city. Talk about how not to win friends and influence people. They come in and they promote gridlock in urban areas by driving their tractors around really slowly and blocking up the major arteries. The Groundswell Movement, in spite of its name, is actually an AstroTurf organization run by something called the Taxpayers Union, which is a right-wing lobby, which receives money from opaque sources. See, again.
Can you just, for some of the audience, can you just give a quick definition of astroturfing, Paul?
Astroturfing is when you put up you pose as something that you're not. And so, the term astroturf comes from artificial grass. Okay. Yep. I mean, if you think of people who play on sports surfaces, you can play on natural grass, you can play on artificial grass, but it's not the real thing.
So this is like, for example, if you think, okay, this population, this culture will be, it's got its concerns and it's got its movements there, but they're pretty intolerant to extreme views. So if we present ourselves in this particular way, we've got our foot in, we've got a wedge perhaps, and we'll astroturf ourselves in a sense that this is what we represent. But once you're inside the cage, then out comes the real McCoy at times, yeah?
Yeah, in fact, it's interesting because, I was thinking, wolf in sheep's clothing. It's a little more sophisticated than that. But what's interesting is when you create astroturf organizations, the idea is that you present a pleasant front on, ideas or motivations that you rather the public did not see up front. And what's interesting about this grassroots movement, besides, the stupidity of their strategy, they're blocking highways and major arteries in urban centers to make the point that urban people need to eat and they get their food from farmers. Again, this is not a farmer organization. This is done by a bunch of urbanites in Wellington, right wing in persuasion, and they haven't been able to control them. What comes out with the groundswell movement is, sure, there's some farmers in gumboots driving around in tractors, but we're now seeing racists, we're seeing white supremacists, we're seeing the misogyny of their banners and their signs against the prime minister. I mean, it's like, you tore a scab, and all this is oozing out. And so even the astroturfers can't control what they've created. And that's the problem with Bannonism and the global diffusion of Trumpism or MAGA, is that you may be able to exploit the fault lines of targeted societies like New Zealand, but you don't know where it's going. I mean, you may tap a little too deep, and someone who's mentally disturbed may decide that enough talk, let's do some action and commit an act of violence. That's the intelligence community within the last 2 weeks has just put out an advisory saying that it is very likely that New Zealand will suffer another terrorist attack within a year, and it's most likely going to come from a lone wolf tied to the anti-vaccination movement.
So what we've got up on screen is something where I think is one of the demonstrations of how dangerous and ill-prepared our security apparatus that wraps around New Zealand's Prime Minister has been in recent weeks. And I think my understanding is, Paul, that they've actually had a bit of a wake-up call on this. But let's just have a quick look at this. This is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, addressing New Zealand accredited media, so supposedly. And this is, it might on the surface just look like a heckle that's going on, but let's play it and then you can speak to that point perhaps.
Sure.
Yep, we've got a bit of a thing there. Here we go. No, I'll go back, Paul. I'll bring that back. But what we've got there is a clip where there was a person that represented and was given some sort of access there, and he was representing Steve Bannon's media outlet, and this was at one of the Prime Minister's press conferences that were for legitimate New Zealand media and accredited media that were here representing others overseas. So it was quite a surprise. Anyway, the interaction. What signals did that give you, Paul? Because it connected to what you were just saying there very much.
Yeah, and I should again point out to people who may not be familiar with this incident, an American resident in New Zealand, who is the New Zealand representative or correspondent for Counterspin, which is Steve Bannon's podcast show, multimedia platform. He got within 2 meters of our prime minister, wearing a counterspin credential, but he's not a credentialed journalist. And he started to harangue her in rather unpleasant terms. Basically, the line of inquiry was about Israel and their vaccination rates. But anyway, he got close to her and was very unfriendly. Let's put it that way.
Let's listen to this now.
And making sure that we're doing everything that we can to reach people that we need to. This is an issue of. This is an issue.
Not working in Israel.
Sir, I'm going to ask. I'm going to answer the questions of the accredited media. Sir, I will shut down the press conference if you do not cease. Sorry, to our accredited members of the gallery here, we might move to an inside venue. Unfortunately, we've got someone who's disrupting your press conference today, so we might reconvene.
Absolutely disgraceful.
So what we didn't see in that clip was the shots of the individual concerned here, and what all he had was basically a video camera and himself. Now, his intentions may have been solely to disrupt and discredit. But what it did signal was how easy it was for anybody of any motivation to get access very closely to the New Zealand Prime Minister at a time where things are very, very heated, and as we understand, significant threats to her person and her family have been in evidence over the last few months, and building perhaps that tension around that. So this is what we were talking about in a sense of, Paul, just to pick up where you were going, where all it takes is for an individual that is fueled by the ideologies of hate or division to take it another step forward, and New Zealand gets itself into a situation of which to date, thank goodness, has never been able to have experienced. But beyond this, getting back to the politics, with the astroturfing, what my interests are here is to look at the political parties that are growing on the basis of whatever political movement is going on at the moment. For example, we mentioned at the front end of this program that the National Party here in New Zealand is suffering a leadership crisis, that as we speak it is in closed meetings in an attempt to determine its immediate leadership issues. Out of the back of that, its natural coalition partner that traditionally polls reasonably low in New Zealand here, the ACT Party, we see that, and once again, it has a libertarian bent to it, a tradition of libertarianism, a tradition of economic reform in that vein as well. And we're seeing its proportion bloating out, and the spill going from the National Party across to that reformist party, the ACT Party. But it looks like its popular polling is going even more than that. And it looks like it's bloating out, potentially capturing some of this movement that we're seeing around New Zealand and in Australia and other liberal democracies. And this is the Trumpites, those that follow the doctrines of Bannon. Now, this is where it can get confusing for people, I think, Paul, in the sense that Trump, we saw when he was president and certainly after, represents some sort of isolationism, some form of nationalism and populism. At the same time, it seemed, if you look at it from a timeline analysis, you can see his administration had a disregard to some of the pillar institutions of a democracy such as the United States. And that, what we're talking about there, is a disregard for the fourth estate in many of its forms, a disregard for the judiciary, a disregard for the operative agencies that operate within an administration's governance. That disrupting tactic, I mean, it's interesting to see where was that heading. You know, what is the end game in that in the United States context? And also, are we seeing a party like ACT here in New Zealand presenting an opportunity for external cultural, ideological influences that we're seeing manifesting on the streets of this country, attaching to a party that already has an open door flapping in the wind of popular appeal, which would suggest come in, sit down, become a part of our legislature. That's where my concern is, that ACT in a nutshell has become a party because of its own successes for needing candidates of which where, would it be this particular movement, for example, taking a large slice, perhaps astroturfing its way into the party? Once inside, what happens? So those, just laying out, those are my observations, those are my concerns, and those are some of the areas where I think we are seeing part of that coming into reality.
Oh yeah, let me preface what I'm going to say for our international viewers and listeners. New Zealand has a very civilized political culture, or has in the past. I, for example, out on my deck out here in the bush, have had the Speaker of Parliament sitting there drinking beers on a warm summer afternoon. My wife, who used to be the president of Young Labour, I was sitting, when we were dating, I was sitting at a table in her apartment, and the then leader of the opposition, Helen Clark, walked in the door and asked for Kate. Nonchalantly, no security detail, nothing of the sort. This has changed. Our prime minister needs a security detail. That was a gross failure on their part to allow that crazy American to get that close. And he's dangerous, okay? He threatens, media people try to interview him. He was threatening them physically. Anyway, hopefully he's being looked into, because he doesn't seem to be of good character. And again, me being a dual citizen, having to go through the character test, I would simply say this guy fails on many fronts. So there's an American level of discourse coming in here that we don't need and we certainly don't want. And that gets to the point. MAGA, Trumpism, Steve Bannon, they may be organic to the United States, a place with a violent political history, with bad race relations. Not that ours are perfect, but you could at least say, well, Trumpism is organic. It's natural in the United States. It is unnatural here in New Zealand. I mean, New Zealand is an otherwise peaceful place. It reminds me, many people think Latin America is all violence and whatnot. I suggest people go to Uruguay. The only other place comparable to me, having traveled the world more or less, to New Zealand is Uruguay, another small country of 4.5 to 5 million. Their democracy is robust. Their political discourse is civil, and so is ours. But this is what's happening. It's getting more and more uncivil because Bannon's crowd, again, this cultural diffusion of MAGAism, is now coming in, and what they're aiming at is people who are disgruntled for what otherwise would be, I don't want to say minor reasons, but not something to start shooting, people about. Vaccination mandates, water rights. We are now having disputes about water rights because our major sources of carbon and pollution happen to be from the agriculture, from the dairy industry in particular. So, these are not, heavy-duty things. We don't have the gun culture that the United States, but it's coming, and it's coming home to roost here in New Zealand. That it's more than pernicious. It's outright dangerous. Now, you mentioned the rise of ACT and the decline of National. National, again, being the big party on the center right. And here's where things get interesting, because National has taken a beating the last two elections after being in power for 9 years. They're in complete disarray. I think their leader just got rolled today. Rolled being, was ousted.
We'll just check that point and get back to you.
Yeah. I think the announcement just came out that she's gone. And again, we're a country with two female leaders. The prime minister and the now recently departed leader of the opposition. I mean, this is where New Zealand is. How can you compare that with the United States, where women can't even make the presidency? We've had two, three female prime ministers. Anyway, without getting into the contrast between these two democracies, the issue though is this: National try to keep to what I will call its New Zealand line. Try not to go too hard on personal insult. Try to resist the Trump style of politics, the Trump strategy, the Roger Stone, Steve Bannon strategy of politics. And what's happened is the ACT Party, which was always a fringe party that would garner at best 5% of the votes, mostly in one rich district in Auckland. So it never had more than one or two parliamentary seats. What they did was they expanded their tent and they diluted their libertarian message, because they used to be a libertarian party. And so it was, about removing regulation, lowering taxation, all those sort of things. And but they were, in terms of individual freedoms, let's say same-sex couples, that sort of thing, they were open. They didn't mind that homosexuals could get married, that sort of stuff. But they never got more than 5% in any electorate. And again, we're always one or two, perhaps three members of parliament. What they've done in two successive elections is they've abandoned their libertarian principles and they've expanded their coattails to include gun rights advocates, to include Christian conservatives. Basically, they're going populist. They're going Trump. And what has happened? They've been rewarded for doing so. They now have 11 members of parliament. The leader of that party, David Seymour, is second in the preferred prime minister polls, ahead of the National Party. ACT is becoming the de facto leader of the right side of the political spectrum in New Zealand. But it's diluted that libertarian message, and it's included the anti-vaxxers, the astroturfers, as you mentioned, a smorgasbord of misfits and malcontents on the right side of the spectrum. And that's the trouble. This could become the tail that wags that party dog.
This is exactly what I mean by this, is the opportunity is there. And this is where I'm interested in developing this idea, that the ACT Party here, had a libertarian foundation, that it had a significant part of its historical culture in that space. We saw that expressed in many ways over the years. Also from the point of view of the gun fraternity, a little bit more than the NRA type of style. It was hands off our guns, hands off us. And this is what we're seeing from this movement of those we are seeing a connection between this movement that is running and the ACT Party. The movement itself has very strong extreme libertarian elements to it. The extreme free speech. I can say anything, no matter how hateful it is, threaten. That is my libertarian right type of extremism is what I'm talking about. Likewise with the freedom elements of political interference in one's life. As long as I'm the most powerful, if I can actually do anything I like, that is okay because of my belief in extreme libertarianism. So it becomes a different kind of beast than perhaps what we think about liberty and freedom in its idealistic sense. And this is where I think it is an issue which the ACT Party is vulnerable to, but also where it connects in an oscillation of self-interest between national populism and extreme libertarianism. And Paul, I know you and I haven't discussed this to the point where we would perhaps have a consensus on that, but that's my suspicion of what we are seeing here in the New Zealand context as a political, cultural, ideological lab rat.
Yeah, look at let's be very clear. This is well known in counterterrorism circles. These sort of views, the Bannon type views, they cloak themselves in the mantle of free speech, movement, and association. Again, it's all about their freedoms, their individual rights. But what they're interested in is promoting division and sowing hate. And to my mind, I have a very clear distinction in my mind between protected offensive speech and hate speech. And I won't get into it, but for me, it's very clear where you draw the line. And I think all this argument about you're infringing on our free speech, etc., is basically camouflage for many elements on the right. Now, you brought up the interesting point of unfettered liberty or unfettered freedom. And that reminded me, in a conversation you and I had a day or so ago, that I was telling you I was finding it hard to capture the word in English. But in Spanish, they differentiate between libertad, which is liberty, freedom, and libertinaje, which the closest I can translate it into is licentiousness. But it's not about sex. It's not, it's the idea that you said it, you can do whatever you want and no one can touch you. Well, that's not democracy. Okay, I mean, where did you get this idea that you can run amok and somehow everybody's got to bite the bullet and allow you to do so? I mean, it's not.
And the ACT Party and what we're talking about, it has a long history of pushing for small government. If you want government out of the road on such things, if we're onto something here, it's a perfect party for it.
Oh, it is. Look at I don't have a lot of time for libertarians. Ayn Rand is the sort of person you read when you're a pimply-faced 14-year-old and a smartass. By the time you turn 20, you jettison that stuff. But these guys are still reading it. And, fine, okay. But at least you're pure. That is, you don't want rules, you don't want laws. Fine. What's happened now, though, is the ACT Party never could get electoral traction by being a libertarian party alone. Again, it'd get 1 or 2 seats in this parliament. Parliament here has 120 seats. So it's, on a road to nowhere. But as soon as they started expanding into the gun lobby, and I might point out to you that the NRA funded the gun lobby's objections to the change in gun legislation after the terrorism attack of 2019. Money came from the NRA. The rhetoric came from the NRA. I was just waiting for the moment where one of the local gun lobbyists would say, "Oh, pry that thing from my cold, dead hands." Yeah. It was just so transparent that it came from outside. It had nothing to do with New Zealand gun culture, which is truly a hunting culture. It's not a self-defense culture. It's about hunting. But they're changing the rhetoric, and it's part of the reason why they got nowhere with that, because they couldn't get any purchase, no traction in a New Zealand public that doesn't sit around with a gun, in their house waiting for some bad guy to show up. And so ACT has moved in that direction. They brought the Christian evangelicals. Now, I have to point out that one of the old leaders of the ACT Party many years ago was a guy who had a unsavory interest in young boys. But their idea was, hey, as long as the boys are not really small and they consent, this is libertarianism taken to an extreme.
Yeah, I know that in the past I raised that with one of the leaders of the ACT Party about, candidate selections, but membership as well, like that extreme kind of view of libertarianism. I think what you're referring to is the United States expression of it, like the man-boy love kind of thing. And I raised about this, that there was a member of the ACT Party that was representing this particular type of thinking. And I raised it with the leader at the time. And he said to me, this is the problem with the smaller parties. He says that you are vulnerable to the difficulties of screening and vetting. Not only, your membership is one thing. That's perhaps further down the pecking order. But the candidates, he says, it was a nightmare. So this is what we're talking about here, isn't it? Of opportunity and exploitation of parties and the party's original constitutional intent once it was in the legislature. And I think, this is what we think. Just at this juncture, Paul, is it a good time to mention some of the comments that have come in? And there's some very thoughtful comments that have come there. And then for you to give the final part of the program and evaluate where we think things are going to end up from the point of view of what is the end game. So if I may, let's just take on here. David Mooring has put in a comment here in the first instance, and he says, given the utterly destructive damage that this ridiculous ideology does, wouldn't it be sensible for all New Zealand political parties to actively and completely disavow themselves from it? So it sounds a reasonable proposition there. There's another thing with respect to the democratic debate, and this comes from Christopher Minto, who I know very well. And Chris says here, I come from the group of centre or centre-right who are sceptical of the PM's economic credentials, but no one should ever threaten the life of another. Yes, people have lost their livelihoods, and I get that they don't feel listened to. So book a meeting with your local electorate minister or opposition rep and talk to them. Personally threatening Ardern, and he says, personally threatening Ardern or anyone else is disgraceful. This is putting it in a nutshell, isn't it, Paul? From people who want to have intellectual political discourse that may come from the centre-right and are feeling like perhaps that this movement is misrepresenting that legitimate voice of opposition. And we can see within the opposition parties it isn't affecting the ACT party at the moment, but with National, it cannot get traction or identity or its self-purpose, it seems, through this pandemic period. So it's an extreme position that we're seeing, and it's coming through. There's another comment from David Mooring here, and he says, unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance, he's saying. So I don't quite get where this is going, but he says, if we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against that. So, there's all sorts of ideas coming through. And Paul, let's pick up on this issue of legitimate opposition discourse and that role of intellectual views and exchange of views that come within that wonderful political culture. Is that being denied at this juncture because of what we are seeing creeping into these mass protests that have an agenda that is orchestrated and conceived from far off these shores?
Okay, well, let's be very, very clear here. The objective that Bannon's strategy has in mind is to influence political discourse in New Zealand so as to elect people in the nationalist populist mode. That is, influence civil society to the point that we start getting candidates running on MAGA platforms, or New Zealand versions of MAGA platforms, and getting elected into office. That's Bannon's strategy. Unlike the Chinese influence operations, which focus on elites, he's not interested in the elites. His preference is to remove them, because they're part of the old liberal democratic establishment. He wants to bring people like Trump, people like some of the Republicans in Congress these days, with a vision. And the reason for that is that for guys like Steve Bannon, Alex Jones, Trump himself, is that they see democracy in instrumental terms. That is to say, they don't see intrinsic value in democracy as a system of governments. They see it as a means by which to achieve and maintain power. In their case, white, patriarchal, heteronormative power. And once liberal democracy does not serve those purposes, it becomes dispensable. Or, and this is where Bannon is an evil genius, you change popular conceptions of what democracy means and does not mean. And so he's working, the fabric of society. And this is interesting because there was an Italian Marxist, a guy who founded the Italian Communist Party, was an opponent of Lenin's and the Communist International at the turn of the 20th century, called Antonio Gramsci. He wound up dying in Mussolini's prisons. But he wrote about how to foment not so much revolution, but resistance to the capitalist order and its political superstructure. And he called that a war of maneuver. A war of position. War of maneuver is revolution, fighting in the streets. A war of position was, he said, you had to fill the trenches of society with a counter-hegemonic ideology. And so for him, the trenches were schools, churches, unions, that you change the discourse inside them, and then they can come out into the open and challenge for power. That's what Bannon's doing. He's focused on the trenches of New Zealand society, Italian society yet again, Brazilian society, where he's trying to fill these social trenches or the fabric of society with a counter-hegemonic discourse, and he uses existing fault lines as well as new ones. So right now, part of the umbrella for the importation of MAGA ideology into New Zealand is the anti-vax movement. Anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-lockdown, all couched in the language of defending personal freedoms. But that's a front, that's a facade. That's not what Bannon and his people are about. They're about, again, white, patriarchal, heteronormative privilege. That's what these guys are about. And so it's interesting because it works. Bannon wouldn't be where he is if his strategies didn't work, but they do. They work very well. Look at the United States. But also look where that sort of, various versions of MAGA have been exported into Europe. Again, I know Latin America because of my own personal circumstances. You're starting to see this crop up in Chile. You're starting to see it crop up in Argentina. I mean, it's very, very dangerous because it is so effective. And so
if you look, sorry, Paul.
Just what I was just going to say is that ACT runs the problem of, and we have to give David Seymour and his advisors a lot of credit.
That's the ACT leader.
Yeah, he's the leader of this ostensibly libertarian party. He expanded their parliamentary presence from 2 or 3 people to 11. I mean, he's got, he's a major swing vote in Parliament. And again, he's the second most favored politician to become Prime Minister.
Yeah, Jacinda Ardern at number 1, the current Prime Minister, and then it's David Seymour.
Our Prime Minister is miles ahead of everybody else. She's very popular. I saw that Chris has got issues with her economic policy, but I agree with him completely. I have my doubts about her on security policy and what have you, but there's no reason to threaten her and her family. I mean, it's just not New Zealand. Again, the United States has a history of political violence, has assassinated presidents. I mean, it's got that baggage. We don't.
Yeah.
And so to see the importation of this violent rhetoric, to see nutter Americans get close to her, with some fake credential, is alarming. Is absolutely alarming. And so
when you look at
what I'm going to finish with is that David Seymour runs this risk. If he sticks to his libertarian principles, he risks losing support for his party in the general public. If he goes ahead and caters to the anti-vax crowd, the gun crowd, the Christian conservative crowd, he will expand the basis of his party. But he runs the risk, A, of diluting the libertarian message, and B, becoming, again, the dog that's wagged by its crazy tail. And that's the dilemma for David Seymour over the next 18 months leading up to the next election, because he's riding high right now, and you can see it in his press conferences. He's feeling great. He's the de facto leader of the right in New Zealand, but that includes the crazy right. And the crazy right is a dangerous right. I mean, let's be honest. For
So
all the
when you
talk
look
about
at
Muslims
this,
and leftists,
yeah,
it's been the right wing of the spectrum that has caused acts of violence here in New Zealand. So
yeah.
it's an interesting dilemma to be in. He's right now he's riding high, but I have a feeling that when the pushing and shoving comes, he's going to have to make a decision one way or the other. Neither one is going to work out well for him.
So in closing, my last question here is relating to, is it possible, because this is a cultural ideological move that we're seeing, it's already here, and we've spoken in past episodes with respect to the United States that in ways that with this movement and its various expressions, the genie is out of the bottle, I think was the word that you used to illustrate that thinking, Paul. In New Zealand, it is here now. Is resistance in trying to actually peel back time to get to a part of political discourse of which existed only 18 months, 2 years ago, is that possible?
It is, but it's going to take some strong measures. I mean, I have been negatively impressed by what I call the Americanization of New Zealand politics over the 2 decades that I've lived here. When I got here, the American influence in politics was minimal. Now, both parties, but particularly the right parties, have American advisors, spin doctors, consultants. That stuff is coming in now, not just as cultural diffusion, but also in terms of political strategizing. Labor tends to take, when it comes to overseas advice, it tends to take advice from the UK Labour Party, and that hasn't served it that well either. But here's the deal. You can tell from my accent that even though I've been here 20 some odd years, I don't speak with a Kiwi accent. And so
Whereas
from time
I
to time, well, it's funny. When I go to the States, they think I'm starting to, turn into a Canadian or something. But here, everybody knows pretty much where I'm from. And from time to time, I will have people abuse me because of some political commentary as that bloody Yank. He should shut up. He's not of us. It's just sort of xenophobic thing. It's not real bad. And it's water off my back, but I get it pretty regularly. When I say something controversial in the media, for example. I actually think that it would be wise, and this goes to David's first question, that the political parties should say that they reject this attempt to import foreign ideologies into our mainstream political discourse. See, the Chinese don't do that openly. They're just, their influence is more subtle. And again, at the level of elites, they're not trying to change New Zealand civil society in a pro-China way. I mean, they're working, at the upper echelons, if you will, of the social hierarchy. Bannon and his crowd are working on us. They're working via social media. They're working for, again, these alternative websites and what have you. They're taking advantage of the technologies that allow for direct marketing, if you will, getting back to that principle of the lab rat. And I think that the best thing that could happen is for all political parties to unite in saying we denounce this attempt to sow division, to promote unrest, to actually subvert the foundations of our liberal democracy by this foreign actor, these foreign entities, and call them out. Call them out. I would say that if, these people like InfoWars and Counterspin are mentioned by name as fifth columnist subversives, with a tongue firmly in cheek, perhaps, I think most New Zealanders will go, we don't want that. I mean, anyone in their right mind does not want the importation of American political fights. I mean, anyone, if you just step back, including my American friends, do you really want American-style politics to come down to Australia and New Zealand? I mean, seriously? No one in their right mind, certainly not a former academic like me, uses the United States as anything other than a failed democracy. In fact, they've just come out with there's a European Institute on Democracy Research that calls the United States a backsliding democracy, that it's regressed, not just over the last 4 to 5 years, but over the last 20 years. The U.S. is regressing. And so, I think if we go that way and go, we in New Zealand, we have our problems. We have both historical problems and some contemporary ones. But one thing we're not is we don't have the U.S.'s problems. And so why import them? Why use what works in the United States as a political strategy and infect us with it? Not to mix metaphors with the pandemic, but if anything needed to be inoculated, it's the body politic from the pernicious, infectious influence of MAGA, Trumpism, and Bannonism. And the more that the political elite, the political society, declares their disinterest in using the techniques, methodologies, and mechanisms of American political strategy and strategists, the better we will be.
Okay, thank you for that, Paul. We'll wrap up the program right now, and I'll just make take another comment that is coming once again from Christopher Minto. Chris says, I agree we should unite against foreign influence. It's a game theory though. The one who doesn't denounce it and takes the support will have the stronger hand and probably win. Their short-term self-interest is to corrupt themselves and take the support of well-resourced radicals. So that's the view that just came in the back of that. And he also adds here, I'll just bring it up to conclude, what's the answer? I'm not sure. Maybe a longer electoral terms. That may come with a few problems as well, but I get your point. I think what I'm taking from that is this idea of stability may be in evidence if we have longer political terms or electoral terms in New Zealand, which will currently sit at 3 years instead of the 4, which is the current status quo amongst most of our partners. Now, Paul, just to wrap up for the New Zealand part of the audience, what we were talking about earlier relating to the National Party's leadership woes and the destabilisation that has been occurring at National Party, that's the main opposition party in New Zealand's doors. It has just been announced through the program that Judith Collins, the leader, has been replaced. There is Shane Retty, who is her deputy, will take an interim role, and we understand from what is coming out of the capital in Wellington at the moment that Mark Mitchell and Christopher Luxon are the two front runners to replace Judith Collins. Just in brief to speak, Mark Mitchell comes from a military background, as was once a very close ally of Judith Collins, who has just been ousted, who was once very much positioned as a candidate at the behest of Judith Collins's people and got into Parliament under her influences there, but soon fell out once he was within the legislature. He fell out with Judith Collins for various reasons, as I understand, quite quickly. Now, Christopher Luxon is the person of choice for the moderate conservatives that once were in existence around John Key. And Christopher Luxon, if he comes through, may actually inject into the leadership something that is quite interesting as a challenge to this popular authoritarian extreme libertarian movement, which we have been discussing today. On those points, thank you once again for attending this as a live recording of A View from Afar, and we will also look forward to coming back at this time next week to pick up perhaps what would be the last episode for 2021 as we head toward the Christmas season. But until that time, thank you very much. Take care out there. Goodbye.